November 26, 1944. South of Hurtgen Forest, Western Front. A freezing wind crawled across the fog-soaked fields as the morning light fought to break through the smoke of burning vehicles. Snowflakes drifted sideways, clinging to steel hulls and shattered branches. The battle had passed only hours before, leaving behind a graveyard of metal, Shermans, half-tracks, and the twisted skeletons of German armor lying silent in the mud. 3 soldiers from the German 116th Panzer Division moved cautiously toward one of the knocked-out American tanks. Lieutenant Karl Weiss, Oberstfreiter Matthias Brunn, and Funker Otto Keller kept their rifles ready, boots sinking into the slush, steam rising from their breath. The tank ahead of them, M4 Sherman, olive paint scarred by shrapnel, still crackled with faint heat. Karl raised a hand. "Langsam," he whispered. Slowly. He didn't trust anything built by the Americans. He had seen too many Shermans knocked out only to erupt later when the ammunition cooked off. But this tank was different. It hadn't exploded. No burnt crew. No charred turret interior. It simply sat there, its engine dead, tracks frozen in place, as if the crew had vanished into thin air. Matthias stepped forward first, brushing away snow from the glassy plate. "It took a hit here," he muttered, tapping a gloved finger against a small, clean penetration mark. A single 75 millimeters. And yet, no fire? Otto frowned. Impossible. Shermans always burn. Everyone knows that. But they would soon discover this was no ordinary Sherman, and the rumors they believed were far from the whole truth. Karl climbed up the side of the hull, gripping the cold handrails. The steel stung his fingers through the gloves. He pulled himself onto the turret roof, where empty shell casings lay scattered beside the open commander's hatch. "They bailed out," Karl said softly. "Left in a hurry." The hatch edges were scuffed, boots had slipped on the snow. The trail of footprints leading toward a distant copse of trees told the rest of the story. The crew had survived. That alone unsettled the Germans more than they cared to admit. He took a breath, braced himself, and lowered his head into the darkness of the turret. Then he froze. The first thing he noticed wasn't the gun controls. Wasn't the ammunition racks. Wasn't the periscope system. It was the space. The inside of the American tank was bright, clean lines, wide seats, padded cushions. Wiring neatly routed. Instruments glowing softly with intact bulbs. Compared to the cramped, oily, suffocating interior of their Panther, this felt unreal. Matthias, leaning in beside him, whispered, "It looks like a locomotive cab." Karl said nothing. For a moment he simply breathed, taking it all in. He dropped into the commander's seat. It patted itself against his weight. There was room to move his knees. There were labels for switches. And behind him, Otto climbed in behind them and gasped loudly enough that his voice echoed off the steel walls. A radio suite. Not one set, but 2, clean, organized, clearly marked, headphones hanging neatly on hooks. The wires didn't tangle. The tuning knobs turned smoothly. Every control had a purpose. Every dial had a label. Karl touched the main receiver gently, as if afraid it would disappear. "This is modern," he muttered. "Far better than ours." Their Panther's radio was crammed against the hull, cables twisted, barely accessible. Half the time it overheated. The Americans, however, had built their Shermans with communication in mind. Commanders could talk to other tanks, to infantry, to artillery, even to air support. This meant American tankers were not fighting blind. "Now I understand," Otto whispered. "How they coordinate so fast. How their armor moves like a swarm." Karl nodded slowly. "And how they hit us before we even see them." But there was more. As Matthias slid into the gunner's position, he discovered another shock. The optics were simple and rugged. Not as precise as German sights, but easier, far easier, to use. A new gunner could learn this in hours. The Germans stared at one another, a realization weighing heavily between them. The Americans were not trying to build the best tank. They were trying to build the best tank crew. "Comfort," Matthias murmured, running his hand across the smooth turret wall. "Radio discipline. Ergonomics. They want their men fighting longer, surviving longer." Karl exhaled slowly, fog swirling in the cold air. A truth was forming in his mind, an uncomfortable one. Maybe the Americans didn't need tigers or panthers. Maybe they didn't need armor thick as a bunker wall. Maybe they understood the war differently. And maybe, just maybe, that was why they were winning. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery rolled across the white fields like thunder. The front line was shifting again. Karl pulled himself back up through the hatch, scanning the horizon. "Mark this tank on the map," he ordered. "High Command will want to see this. They need to know what we're up against." The three Germans stood silently on the hull as the wind howled around them, each soldier realizing that what they had seen inside this American machine would change the way they viewed the enemy forever. Snow crunched beneath their boots as Karl, Matthias, and Otto circled the Sherman, their breath fogging the air. The winter wind carried the dull rumble of distant artillery, American, by the rhythm of it. The forest behind them hissed as sleet whispered through the pines. Every sound reminded them the front was dangerously close. But none of that mattered now. Karl knelt beside the tank's rear hull, wiping away soot to inspect the engine compartment. The hit that disabled the Sherman hadn't ignited anything. That was unheard of. German tanks lived with the constant threat of internal fires. Panthers and Tigers burned hot, fuel lines exposed, ammunition stacked deep and unprotected. Even the mighty Tiger II was notorious for catastrophic detonations. Not this Sherman. Karl tapped the hull. "Wet stowage," he murmured, repeating a term he'd heard from captured American crewmen. "Their ammunition is stored with water jackets. If they're hit, it doesn't explode." Matthias raised an eyebrow. So the stories were wrong? Not every Sherman is a Tommy Coker? The nickname, Tommy Cooker, hung in the air like an accusation. Karl didn't answer. Instead, he pulled open a side storage box. Inside, packed with machine-like precision, lay ration tins, spare tools, and a small pot still warm from the residual heat of battle. Otto reached in, lifting a rectangular metal container. "Gott im Himmel," Otto muttered. "They keep coffee inside the tank?" It was real, still fragrant, the scent cutting sharply through the cold air. Matthias scoffed. "No wonder they fight so long. We get barley water. They get half a cafe inside a steel box." But the shock wasn't over. Karl climbed back into the turret, this time crouching beside the driver's compartment. His gloved hand traced the layout. Large padded seat. Foot pedals placed wide apart. Labeled controls. A hatch above the driver's head big enough to escape through quickly. A periscope aligned perfectly with the steering yoke. Matthias joined him, squeezing next to the gun breech. "This is absurd. There's room for two grown men in here without touching elbows." Karl's thoughts flickered to his own Panther. Inside, every movement had to be calculated. Backs bent, knees crammed, hands squeezed between metal plates designed without mercy. A Panther gunner often left battle with bruises from the recoil guard alone. The Sherman felt like another world, built for humans, not heroes. Otto slid into the bow gunner's seat, running a finger along the intercom system mounted neatly beside the radio. "And this," he said, voice trembling with a mix of awe and frustration, "lets the whole crew speak through the headset. No shouting over the engine. No guessing commands." Karl swallowed. Communication. Comfort. Safety. Efficiency. The Americans had designed their tank crews to survive. And crews that survived learned. And crews that learned won battles. Matthias leaned back, staring at the ceiling of the turret. "Our tanks are monuments. Cathedrals of steel. But I wonder," he hesitated, "are there's tools?" Karl didn't answer immediately. He felt something shifting inside him, a realization painful in its honesty. Engineering was not just about armor thickness or muzzle velocity. It was about endurance, coordination, human ability. The Sherman, humble and mocked, was a machine built around its crew, not above them. A distant burst of automatic fire cracked through the wind. All three men froze. Then Karl spoke. "We must go. American patrols will return soon." They climbed out, boots slipping on the snow-coated hull. The moment Karl's feet hit the frozen earth again, he felt it, an unease deep in his gut. This tank had shown them something German doctrine had ignored for too long. War wasn't won by perfect machines. It was won by crews who could fight again tomorrow. He glanced back at the Sherman one last time. The tank loomed like a quiet truth in the blizzard, ordinary in shape, extraordinary in design. "Come," he ordered softly. "We report to command. They must understand what we've seen." They began the long trudge back toward their lines. But each step felt heavier, burdened with the knowledge that they had witnessed something that made their own armored giants feel suddenly old. Behind them, the Sherman sat silently as snow fell thicker, burying steel under white. Soon it would vanish beneath winter's veil. But the idea it planted in their minds would not. The forest swallowed them as they moved deeper into German-held territory, boots sinking into frostbitten leaves. The sky darkened as afternoon bled toward evening, snow falling in thick curtains that muffled every sound. By the time Karl, Matthias, and Otto reached their forward command dugout, an old farmer's cellar reinforced with logs, the cold had worked its way into their bones. Inside, lanterns flickered against the walls. Maps lay scattered across a wooden table. Cigarette smoke clung to the air like a low-hanging fog. Feldwebel Ulrich Drexler, the intelligence NCO, looked up as the three men entered, soaked with snow and shaken. Karl saluted stiffly. "Herr Feldwebel, we inspected a disabled American tank near Sector Grundre." Drexler raised an eyebrow. "A Sherman? What did you find? More cheap steel and gasoline fumes?" Karl hesitated, and the room grew quiet. "No, Herr Feldwebel. We found something else." Matthias placed his helmet on the table, shaking snow from his coat. It was unlike anything we've seen. Spacious. Organized. Radios, more than one. Intercom. Ammunition stored to prevent detonation. Drexler leaned forward, cigarette suspended between his fingers. "Careful, Oberschreider. You sound almost impressed." Otto stepped in. Not impressed, concerned. He gestured with his hands, as if sketching the interior of the tank from memory. The Americans built that machine around its crew. Every lever, every switch, every seat, designed for speed and survival. Karl nodded. And communication. Their radios allow entire companies to coordinate movements in minutes. Our Panthers, half the time, can't even reach Battalion HQ without antenna interference. The Feldwebel sat silently for a moment, expression tightening. He wasn't a frontline tanker, but he knew enough to understand the implications. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the Americans are not simply throwing steel at us. They're outthinking us." Karl met his eyes. "Yes." A heavy quiet settled over the room. Drexler finally stood, grinding his cigarette into a tin plate. "Come with me. The Hauptmann must hear this." They followed him down a corridor of sandbags and wooden beams into a larger command chamber. There, hunched over maps and supply lists, stood Hauptmann Lucas Ehrlich, commanding officer of the battalion's reconnaissance and intelligence section. His uniform was crisp despite the mud and cold, his expression severe. Drexler cleared his throat. "Herr Hauptmann, these men bring unusual findings." Ehrlich didn't look up. "Speak." Karl stepped forward. "Sir, we inspected the captured Sherman on Ridge 43. It contains features that significantly alter our understanding of American armor doctrine." Ehrlich finally lifted his head, eyes sharp. "Explain." Karl took a breath. "The interior is designed with ergonomics in mind. Controls labeled. Seats cushioned. Easy access to optics and radios. Ammunition is stored in a wet system to prevent fires." Ehrlich slammed a hand onto the table. The sound echoed off the dirt walls. "Impossible. American tanks burn. Every tanker knows this." Matthias shook his head. "Not this one, sir. It took a 75mm penetration and did not ignite. The crew escaped alive." "And the radios," Otto added. 2 full sets. Better wiring than ours. Clear labeling. Headphones for every crewman." The Hauptmann stared at them in disbelief, then at Drexler, who simply shrugged. Karl continued, voice steady. "Their advantage is not their armor. It is coordination, survivability, speed of communication." Silence. Then Ehrlich muttered, almost to himself, "So that is how they encircle so quickly, how their attacks seem to come from multiple directions at once." He stepped back, running a hand across his jaw. For the first time, the officer looked uncertain. Carl pressed on. "Sir, if we underestimate the Americans again, we risk losing more than battles. We risk losing the war of adaptation." Ehrlich's eyes snapped up. "So you propose what? That the Panther, our best tank, has been over-engineered? That the Tiger is too slow? Too complex? Too," he struggled for a word, "aristocratic?" Otto swallowed. "Sir, their tanks are democratic." All heads turned toward him. Otto explained, cheeks flushed from the audacity of his own words. "Every man inside a Sherman can reach what he needs. Every role is simple. If the gunner dies, the loader can take over. If the driver is hit, the bow gunner moves forward. It's built so anyone can fight." Carl added, "It is built for war. Not for pride." Ehrlich stared at the candle on his desk, its flame trembling. Finally, he exhaled and sat. "We will write a report," he said quietly. "A full analysis. And the High Command will read it whether they like it or not." Matthias exchanged a glance with Carl, half relief, half dread. The truth was out. But truth in wartime rarely traveled far. And even when it did, it often arrived too late. Ehrlich stood again, determination hardening his voice. "Return to the tank at first light. Document everything. Measure the compartments. Sketch the radio layout. If the Americans fight with tools like this, we must understand them before they overrun us." Carl nodded. "Joel, Hauptmann." But as they turned to leave, the ground shuddered beneath their feet. A distant boom rolled through the forest like a warning. American artillery. Walking closer. Ehrlich looked back at them. "Move quickly. Whatever is inside that Sherman, it is now a race against their advance." Dawn had not yet broken. The world was a half-frozen silhouette, trees bending under the weight of fresh snow, fog crawling low across the fields, the sky a dead gray dome pressing down on everything beneath it. Carl, Matthias, and Otto trudged through the underbrush with their gear packed tight. Notebooks, grease pencils, measuring tape, and a battered Rolleiflex camera borrowed from the reconnaissance platoon. Every step sank into slush. Every breath stung their lungs with icy air. Somewhere ahead, beyond a thin line of twisted pines, lay the disabled Sherman. Somewhere behind them, American artillery was crawling closer. "Faster," Carl whispered. "We don't have much time." Matthias grumbled, pulling his scarf over his nose. "I'd rather face a Panther mechanical breakdown than outrun American howitzers." Otto snorted. "At least the howitzers don't explode spontaneously when you look at them." Carl cracked a thin smile but kept his eyes sharp. He knew what today meant. If they did not reach the Sherman before American armor swept the ridge again, their discovery would be lost, buried under fire and mud. As they crested a small rise, the tank emerged through the fog like a sleeping giant. Snow had crusted along its turret edges. Ice clung to the barrel. A crow perched on the commander's cupola flew off, startled by their approach. Carl climbed onto the hull. His gloved hands brushed aside the snow covering the turret hatch. "All right, we document everything. Quickly but thoroughly." Matthias nodded and began wiping the gun breech clean inside the turret. Otto positioned himself in the driver's compartment, flipping switches and adjusting dials. Carl snapped photographs, interior shots, control panels, radio wiring, ammunition racks. Each click of the Rolleiflex echoed hollowly in the steel space. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling the truth became. "See here," Otto called out. "The periscope mount. It rotates with almost no stiffness. Ours jam half the time when frozen." Matthias added, "The loader's rack is clear. Organized. No stepping around ammunition. He just pivots and loads. No wasted motion." Carl recorded it all. If German engineers saw even half of this, it could change the way they built tanks. He reached into a small drawer beneath the commander's seat and froze. A laminated checklist. Step-by-step procedures for firing, movement, damage control. In 3 languages, English, French, and German. He held it up. Look at this. Matthias leaned over. They prepare for everything. Even for captured personnel. No, Carl whispered. This isn't for us. This is for Allied crews, immigrants, volunteers, anyone who joins the fight. They make the tank usable by anyone. Otto exhaled sharply. Unsergat. But a thunderous boom rolled across the valley. All three men jerked their heads toward the west. Artillery. But closer. Much closer. Matthias scrambled up the turret. Sir, American smoke rounds. They're screening for a push. Carl's pulse kicked. We have 10 minutes at most. Maybe less. He snapped the final photographs and began scribbling measurements into his notebook. The letters blurred as his breath fogged the page. The ground rumbled again, this time a steady vibration. Engines. Tank engines. Otto's face went pale. Shermans. A whole column. Matthias swore under his breath. We can't outrun tanks in open snow. Carl stood atop the hull, scanning the tree line where faint outlines moved behind the drifting smoke. The silhouettes were unmistakable. 7 Shermans advancing in a wedge formation. And behind them, infantry in thick winter gear. The Americans were reclaiming the ridge. Carl jumped down. Grab everything. Now. They tore out their equipment, stashing papers and camera rolls into their coats. Snow showered from the branches as they sprinted toward a ravine that dipped away from the clearing. But halfway down the slope, Matthias slipped, crashing onto his side. The camera tumbled from his hand, sliding across the snow. Carl lunged for it, snatching it just before it vanished beneath the white drift. Danke, Matthias gasped, scrambling to his feet. Move! Carl barked. Behind them, the American tanks reached the captured Sherman. A commander popped out of the hatch, scanning with binoculars. Infantry spread out, rifles ready. A shot cracked, then another. Bullets snapped past the trees. Down! Otto shouted. They dove behind a fallen trunk as machine gun fire stitched the snow around them. Bark flew. Ice shattered into the air. Carl pressed himself tight against the wood. They've spotted movement. We need to disappear. Matthias nodded. There's a drainage culvert 50 meters east. It connects to the lower forest. Otto peeked over the log. We'll be shot before we reach it. Carl scanned the ground, heartbeat hammering. Then he saw it, a shallow gully winding between thick boulders. Follow me, he whispered. Stay low. Don't look back. They crawled. Through snow. Through thorns that clawed at their coats. Behind them, the engines roared louder as the Shermans fanned out. American voices drifted through the cold air. Check that slope. Movement down there. Keep your eyes open. A flare burst overhead, green light flooding the forest. Carl clenched his teeth. One wrong movement, and they'd be silhouettes against the snow. He motioned sharply. They sprinted the last meters to the gully, sliding down into its narrow safety as tracer rounds hissed over their heads. They were alive, for now. But the Americans were spreading. The window to escape was closing. And deep in Carl's coat, the camera film vibrated with every heartbeat. Inside those tiny frames was a truth that could shake the German armored corps to its core. The gully swallowed them whole, narrow, cold, and slick with half-frozen runoff. Roots hung overhead like clawed fingers. The walls rose steep and uneven on either side, offering cover but little comfort. Carl landed first, sliding on his palms. Otto and Matthias tumbled after him, rolling into the deep shadows beneath an overhanging ledge. Above them, the muffled roar of tank engines vibrated through the earth. Snow drifted from the gully's rim with every shell burst and every Sherman track grinding over the frozen soil. Stay low, Carl hissed. They crouched, breaths held tight. American infantry fanned across the ridge above them, boots crunching, rifles sweeping side to side, voices cutting through the cold. Spread out. They ran this way. Check every ditch. Carl's heart pounded against his ribs. The gully was only safe if it stayed unnoticed. Then came the crunch of boots just overhead. A squad. 6, maybe 7 men. Close enough that Carl could hear the straps of their gear creak. Matthias pressed himself deeper against the mud wall. Otto closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. A single cough, a shift of snow, even a reflection off Carl's lens cap could give them away. One American soldier stopped directly above them, right foot planted near the gully's edge. Carl stared at the boots, brown leather soaked dark with melting snow. The soldier adjusted his grip on his M1 Garand. Another voice called out, "You see anything?" The soldier paused, leaned forward. Carl felt the world narrow into a single heartbeat. Then the soldier shook his head. "No. If they came this way, they're ghosts." Their footsteps continued down the ridge. Only when the voices faded did Carl let out a shuddering breath. Otto whispered, "We need to move before they circle back." Carl nodded. "Follow the gully until it bends. Keep your heads down." They moved fast, half running, half crawling, water sloshing around their boots. The frozen ground numbed their feet until they could barely feel each step. Above them, the echoes of American armor grew softer, but not distant enough to ease the tension. After 100 meters, the gully split in two. A wide left branch with gentle slopes. A dark right branch, narrow and twisting sharply into the forest. Matthias pointed left. Easier terrain. Faster. Carl pointed right. Harder to follow. Better cover. Otto scanned the ridge. Americans are pushing east. If we take the easy path, they'll see us. Carl didn't wait. Right branch. Now. They turned sharply into the dark cut of earth. The walls narrowed until they had to move single file. Overhanging roots brushed their helmets. It was claustrophobic, the kind of terrain where one wrong foot could send a man skidding into a broken ankle. But it hit them. Snow thickened over the gully's rim, forming a pale canopy that filtered the morning light into a bluish glow. The sounds of battle faded until only their own breaths and the crunch of ice underfoot remained. Then the gully opened into a clearing. A frozen creek ran across it, thin ice glistening like cracked glass. Otto stepped forward, testing the edge with his boot. "It'll hold," he whispered. "I think." A distant rumble cut him off. All three froze. That wasn't artillery. It wasn't tank engines. It was something heavier, more rhythmic. Carl whispered, "Listen." Matthias's eyes widened. Aircraft. They dove into the snow as the first American P-47 Thunderbolt screamed overhead, engines roaring like a beast tearing through the sky. Bullets stitched the treetops, splinters raining down in a violent shower. Otto shouted over the roar, "They think we're armor. They're strafing the ridge." The Thunderbolt banked hard, circling for another pass. Snow blasted upward as its machine guns raked the forest again, closer this time. Carl grabbed Matthias by the collar. "Into the creek bed. The ice will shield us." They scrambled across the frozen surface, slipping, sliding, nearly falling through in places where the water was visible beneath hairline fractures. Another pass. The air screamed. Rounds smashed into the clearing, kicking up clouds of slush. The three men dove beneath the creek's overhang, pressing into a hollow where the snow-packed bank created a natural bunker. Ice hung from the roots like jagged teeth. The ground shook with every impact. For a moment, it felt like the world was coming apart. Then, silence. The thunderbolt roared away, fading into the distant sky. Only then did the Germans pull themselves from the icy hollow, shaking, soaked, but alive. Matthias collapsed backward, panting. "This is madness. We're risking everything for a few photographs." Carl pulled the camera tighter against his chest. "Not photographs." He locked eyes with both men. Proof that our tanks are relics. Proof that we cannot win this war the way we are fighting it." Otto nodded slowly. "If the High Command listens." Carl finished the thought. "We might still have a chance." The snow began falling harder, thicker flakes, faster winds. Matthias stood, scanning the tree line. "We need shelter. The storm's turning bad." Carl adjusted his coat. "And we need to reach command by nightfall. If the Americans push further east, this whole forest becomes their territory." He looked at the sky, darkening fast. "Move." They pressed deeper into the woods, heading toward German lines that felt farther away with every step. But the film inside Carl's coat remained warm, protected, like a spark waiting to ignite. A spark powerful enough to challenge the myths of the fatherland. Snow hammered the forest now, thick, heavy flakes that blurred the world into shifting gray shapes. The wind whistled through skeletal branches, sending icy shards into their faces. Carl, Matthias, and Otto trudged forward, leaning into the storm as though pushing against an invisible wall. The forest grew denser as they moved east. Pine trunks rose like black pillars in the storm, their upper branches creaking under the weight of winter. Each step was a battle, snow up to their shins, packs dragging at their shoulders, breath burning in their lungs. Visibility is dropping, Matthias said through clenched teeth. We'll get turned around. Carl wiped frost from his goggles and scanned ahead. A worn trail, barely visible beneath the accumulating snow, led toward a slope that dropped into a shallow valley. That ravine leads toward our lines, he said. If the maps are right. Otto snorted, teeth chattering. When have the maps been right this week? Carl didn't answer. He couldn't afford doubt, not when the Americans were expanding their foothold with every passing hour. The ridge where the Sherman lay was already lost. The push eastward would not stop there. The film in his coat felt heavier than anything he carried. Every frame mattered. Every measurement mattered. This was more than intelligence. It was a warning, one the armored corps desperately needed. The three men descended into the valley. The wind died slightly, but only because the trees swallowed it. A hush fell over the world, broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant rumble of artillery, German guns firing somewhere beyond the snow curtain. Good sign, Otto whispered. Our lines can't be far. They trudged on. The valley narrowed until it channeled them between steep, wooded slopes. Fresh fox tracks crisscrossed the snow. An abandoned ammunition crate, half buried and split open, lay beside a fallen tree, its contents scavenged long ago. Then voices. Carl halted, raising a fist for silence. Matthias and Otto froze, dropping to their knees. Muffled at first. Then clearer. Men speaking German. Carl's shoulders sagged in relief. Friendly? He hesitated, listening closer. They were hit near the old bridge, no survivors. Americans advancing fast, tanks, lots of them. Pull back to Hauptstellung before nightfall. Infantry. Wehrmacht. And close. Carl motioned silently, and they followed the sound through a curtain of hanging branches. Soon, the silhouettes of German soldiers emerged, 10 men in snow-patterned smocks, rifles slung, helmets dusted white. Their NCO, a stern-looking Oberschütz with frost-bitten cheeks, spotted Carl's group approaching. Halt! Guns lifted. Carl raised both hands, stepping forward. Kameraden! Feldaufklärung, under Hauptmann Ehrlich. The NCO lowered his rifle, though his eyes stayed cautious. You fools look like you crawled out of a blizzard. Otto coughed. We did. Where are you headed? The NCO asked. Carl gestured east. Back to divisional command. We have critical intelligence. The NCO scoffed. Good luck. Americans are hitting every route. We're falling back toward Langenhof Ridge. If you don't move quickly, you'll be cut off. Matthias asked, What's the fastest way? The NCO pointed down a narrow deer path. Follow this until you reach an old hunting cabin. After that, cross the frozen marsh and stay under the tree line. Our outpost is 2 kilometers east. Carl nodded. Danke. Before he moved on, the NCO caught his arm. You said intelligence? Carl hesitated. Ja. Something important? Carl met the man's eyes. Very. The NCO studied him, then stepped aside. Then move. Whatever you're carrying. Make sure command hears it before the front shifts again. Carl motioned to Matthias and Otto. They slipped past the squad, pushing deeper into the trees. The deer path twisted like a snake, narrowing between tangled roots and boulders. Snow coated everything in white silence. After 10 minutes, the forest opened to reveal the hunting cabin, a small structure of gray logs, half collapsed and buried in drifts. A faint trail rose from its chimney. Carl dropped instantly into a crouch. Someone's inside. Otto drew his sidearm. German or American? Matthias shook his head. Could be either. Carl signaled them forward. Step by step they approached, moving from tree to tree. The snow muffled everything, including the crunch of their boots. Carl pressed his ear against the cabin wall. Movement. Wood creaking. Something metallic shifting. Matthias mouthed silently. One person? Two? Carl couldn't tell. He pointed to the door. Otto took one side, Matthias the other. Carl raised 3 fingers. 3, 2, he kicked the door open and froze. A lone German tanker sat by the stove, wrapped in blankets, face pale, eyes sunken. His uniform was from a Panther crew. His left arm was splinted crudely. His right boot was missing. He looked up slowly, blinking in the dim light. You're Germans, he whispered in disbelief. Carl lowered his weapon. Who are you? The man swallowed hard. Unteroffizier Franz Heiden. Panzerabteilung 509. My tank was hit yesterday. Carl stepped closer. How did you survive? Heiden's gaze drifted, haunted. It wasn't the hit, he said quietly. It was the fire. Panthers burn so quickly. Matthias exchanged a grim look with Otto. Heiden's voice cracked. 3 of my crew were trapped. I crawled out through the driver's hatch, ran until I fainted. Carl knelt beside him, mind racing. Listen to me. We inspected a captured Sherman. Their crews survived hits that would kill ours. Heiden blinked slowly, as if the thought was unreal. How? Carl reached into his coat, touching the precious camera film. Because their tanks are built differently. For the men inside. Heiden closed his eyes and whispered, then we never stood a chance. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the cabin walls. Carl's jaw tightened. We need to reach command with this information. Can you walk? Heiden shook his head weakly. My leg is frozen. I'd slow you down. Otto stepped forward. We're not leaving you. Heiden grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength. You must. The Americans are coming. Save who you can. Warn the others. Carl hesitated. The storm grew louder. The ground vibrated. Distant engines. Shermans. Matthias whispered. Oh, they're close. Carl stood, fighting the surge of dread tightening around him. The cabin door rattled in the wind. They had minutes, maybe less. The truth inside Carl's coat had to survive. And so did they. The sky above the French treetops was turning the color of dying embers, purple bruised with red, when Carl and the others finally reached the forward repair depot. Their boots were soaked, their greatcoats stiff with frost, their faces tight with exhaustion. But there was something else in their expressions too. A quiet alarm. A realization they hadn't yet spoken aloud. Floodlights flickered over the half-destroyed village street as mechanics hurried between Panthers and half-tracks. The smell of oil, cordite, and wet uniforms clung to the air. Engines coughed, hammers rang, and in the distance, far too close, American artillery whistled again. Major Horst, the armored battalion's operations officer, stood beneath a canvas awning reviewing maps. His face was thin, sharp, carved by too many sleepless nights. When he saw Carl and the others, he motioned them forward. You found the tank? Horst asked. Carl nodded. A Sherman. Intact. Mostly. Horst narrowed his eyes. Carl exchanged glances with Matthias and Otto. The words were harder to form than expected. Sir, Carl began slowly. It's not what we were told. Horst raised an eyebrow. Explain. Carl took a breath, then delivered the truth. The Americans are not sending crews to die inside death traps. Their tanks are comfortable, organized, efficient. Radios in every position, intercoms linking every crewman, ammunition stored safely, escape hatches designed for speed. He swallowed, remembering the padded seat under his hand. Sir, they design every detail around the crew. Matthias stepped forward. And that means they fight longer, recover faster. They coordinate better. Their crews stay alive. Horst stared at them, silent. Otto added in a quiet voice, their tank feels like a tool, sir. One meant to be used every day. Day after day. Not a relic. Not a monument. Karl expected anger, reprimand, accusation. Horst sighed. A slow, heavy sigh that carried months of hidden frustration. I know, the major finally said. I've read the reports from the Eastern Front. Some from Normandy. The Americans do not worship their tanks. They use them. His eyes hardened. But Berlin won't hear it. They love armor thickness and gun size. Simple figures for simple pride. Lightning cracked in the distance, artillery flares. Horst stepped closer, lowering his voice. Tell me every detail. And so they did. For almost an hour, the three men described the Sherman's interior, the layout, the comfort, the radios, the fire suppression, the way it felt alive in a way no German tank did. Horst listened without interruption. His face tightened as the truth unfolded. When they finished, he dismissed the scribe and leaned against the table, staring at the map. Do you understand what this means? Horst said softly. Karl nodded. It means they can lose crews less often. And a crew that survives learns. And a crew that learns becomes elite, Horst finished. He tapped the map lightly. An army that treats its soldiers as replaceable loses the future with every battle. An army that protects its men gains something we cannot measure. Outside, a Panther engine roared as mechanics pushed it back into the line. The sound thundered across the depot. Horst looked toward it with something like bitterness. Germany built masterpieces, he said. But masterpieces break. And when they break, only specialists can repair them. American tanks? A farmhand could fix half of what fails. Otto muttered, their tank feels like a workshop. Ours feels like a church. Horst gave a sad smile. Churches do not win wars. Lightning flashed again, distant but approaching. The thump of American artillery grew louder. Karl felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Sir, he asked carefully, what should we do? Horst folded the report. His eyes were dark but steady. We prepare, he said. Because the next time you face Shermans, you won't be fighting poor machines. You'll be fighting crews that can think, coordinate, and survive. He looked toward the front line. And that is how wars turn. The wind shifted. Snow swirled between the depot tents. A mechanic shouted for help tightening a Panther's final drive. Again. The engine coughed like an old man struggling for breath. Karl watched it, realizing how fragile their giants truly were. For the first time since he joined the Armored Corps, he felt something he never expected. Not fear of Allied weapons, but fear of Allied ideas. War was changing, and Germany was running out of time to change with it. Just before dawn, the battalion rolled back toward the front, engines growling through the freezing dark. The roadway was a torn ribbon of mud and snow, gouged by tank treads, splintered by artillery, and lit only by the weak red glow of convoy lamps. Karl's Panther lurched and rattled as it moved, its suspension stiff, its interior vibrating like a diesel drum. Inside, the noise was overwhelming. The 700 horsepower Maybach engine thundered just inches behind the turret wall. Every command had to be shouted. Every vibration hammered through boots, knees, ribs. The smell of fuel mixed with burned oil. Sweat formed in the cramped space despite the cold. Karl felt it more than ever now, the contrast. The Panther was a weapon. The Sherman was a workplace. By the time they reached the assembly point near the treeline, the eastern sky was bleeding pale orange. A thin mist hovered over the fields where hedgerows once stood. American artillery had chewed the landscape into a maze of shattered trunks and smoking craters. Matthias, wiping frost from the gun sight, muttered into the intercom, "Do you think they'll come with Shermans today?" Karl replied, "They always do." "And do you think," Otto said from the bow gunner's seat, "their crew spent last night warm inside that metal cottage they call a tank?" Karl didn't answer, but he knew the truth. American tanks had heaters. Insulation. Ventilation that didn't suffocate the men inside. Even their seats were spring-mounted to absorb recoil. The Sherman wasn't just engineered, it was inhabited, like a small moving room. At 6:40, the order crackled through the radio. Achtung! Prepare for contact. American armor advancing from the south road. Carl steadied himself. The turret hummed as Matthias adjusted traverse. The snow outside glowed faintly as the sun finally crested the distant ridge. Then they appeared. Shermans. Dozens of them. Rolling in formation, spaced perfectly, coordination crisp. The lead platoon fanned out to avoid bunching on the incline. A second wave followed behind in staggered columns. But what struck Carl wasn't their number. It was the movement, smooth, disciplined, choreographed. American doctrine. Crews talk. Crews coordinate. Crews move like a single organism. Carl lifted his binoculars. Through the glass, he could see the turret hatches. Open. Commanders standing upright, wind in their faces, radios in their ears. They communicated with one another in real time, something German tanks, restricted by intercom limitations and radio shortages, could rarely match. Matthias, Carl said quietly, target the lead Sherman. The Panther barked. The recoil slammed through the turret, rattling everyone's bones. A 75mm AP shell streaked across the field and struck the Sherman dead center. A burst of sparks. Armor plate peeled. The tank lurched to a halt. But then, no fire. No explosion. The hatch flew open. The crew bailed out. All of them. Alive. Carl felt his stomach sink. He knew why. Wet ammunition stowage. Fire suppression systems. Ergonomic escape routes. These men were trained to survive. The tank was designed to let them survive. And now, those survivors would join another Sherman, another crew, another fight. The Sherman platoon didn't panic. They adjusted instantly, shifting left, firing smoke, flanking. Communication was precise, rapid, like they were all plugged into one brain. Inside the Panther, Carl had to shout twice just to be heard over the engine. Traverse left. They're crossing the ridge. Matthias snapped back. I can barely hear you. Speak louder. Otto yelled, radios breaking again. I'm losing command net. The Panther, a masterpiece, fought its own crew as much as the enemy. Outside, Shermans surged forward, covering one another with bounding maneuvers. One reversed into defilade. Another advanced to fire. A third roared sideways through the smoke, using its superior turret rotation to snap a shot at Carl's flank. They missed barely. But Carl realized something terrible. These tanks were not superior machines. These crews were superior together. Because their tanks allowed them to be. A second Sherman fired. The shell glanced off the Panther's glacis, but the impact rang like a cathedral bell. Matthias cursed. Otto slapped his headphones, trying to fix the crackling intercom. Through the periscope, Carl saw the truth he had discovered in the woods becoming reality on the battlefield. The Americans didn't fear losing tanks. They feared losing crews. And because their crews lived, their army grew stronger every single day. Sir! Otto shouted. Another platoon coming, more Shermans. Carl steadied his breath. Then we hold. We must hold. But deep down, as the American wave advanced again, coordinated, confident, and relentless, he understood. This wasn't a battle of machines anymore. It was a battle of philosophies. And Germany's philosophy was cracking under the cold morning light. The battlefield was now a furnace of clashing steel and clinging smoke. Snow melted into mud beneath the heat of muzzle flashes. Trees splintered like dry bones. The air tasted of cordite, diesel, and the metallic sting of fear. Carl's Panther rocked violently as a Sherman round struck the turret ring, jarring every man inside. Sparks showered downward. The intercom screeched. Matthias cursed, grabbing the elevation wheel with both hands. They're everywhere, he gasped. Puff. Another platoon moving through the orchard. Carl swept his binoculars across the horizon and froze. The American Shermans weren't fighting like German tanks. They were fighting like a team. Each movement was coordinated. Each advance covered. Each retreat deliberate. And all of it, Carl knew, was made possible because inside every Sherman, every crewman could speak clearly to every other crewman. No shouting. No confusion. No missed commands. Carl's Panther lurched again as Matthias fired. The 75mm rounds smashed through a Sherman's side armor, detonating its ammunition. Flames shot out of the hatches. Carl watched for a moment. Would the crew escape? 3 men vaulted out. The loader, the commander, the driver. Smoke coiled from their uniforms, but they were alive. And even as they ran, another Sherman pulled forward to block line of fire, shielding them under a curtain of smoke rounds. Crew survival wasn't an accident. It was doctrine. Inside the Panther, Otto slammed a fist against the radio. Command net is completely gone. I can't hear a damn thing from battalion. Carl grit his teeth. Try again. Any channel. But Otto knew it was useless. German doctrine issued 1 radio per tank, usually only for the commander. The loader, the gunner, the driver, the bow machine gunner? They had to catch shouted orders over the deafening engine. And the Panther's Maybach roared like a monster. Meanwhile, every single Sherman on the field was networked, dozens of radios talking across platoons, companies, even to air support. Carl felt the imbalance like a physical weight pressing against his ribs. Matthias shouted, "Another Sherman, 3 o'clock. I see it." Carl snapped. But they weren't fast enough. A Sherman, half in cover, angled its hull and fired first. The round slammed into the Panther's right track with a sickening crunch. The tank jerked violently and then stopped moving entirely. The interior lights flickered. "Track's gone." Otto yelled. "We're immobilized." The worst possible fate for a German tank. "Rotate turret." Carl ordered. Matthias strained at the traverse wheel, sweat freezing instantly on his brow. "It's stiff. Something jammed." Then Carl heard it. The grinding clatter of Sherman engines closing in. Several of them. The smoke parted. For Shermans were encircling them, moving in a perfect pincer, their guns trained, their spacing deliberate and practiced. It wasn't a brawl. It was an execution. Carl whispered almost to himself, "How are they this coordinated?" Matthias swallowed. Because they talk to each other. Because they survive each battle. Because they learn. Carl felt the bitter truth lodge in his chest. German tanks were better on paper. Shermans were better in war. "Crew, prepare to bail." Carl ordered. But before they moved, the Shermans did something unexpected. They didn't fire. One of the American commanders, standing tall in his open hatch, gestured sharply with his arm. His platoon repositioned again, shifting to avoid a crossfire hazard. They weren't panicking. They weren't reckless. They weren't hungry for kills. They were operating with discipline, like they had fought battles just like this hundreds of times. And maybe they had, because their crews survived long enough to gain experience. German crews rarely did. A burst of MG fire snapped overhead as the Americans suppressed another German position. Carl used the moment to act. "Bail. Go. Out now." The crew shoved open their hatches and poured into the freezing air. Snow struck Carl's face like needles. Smoke washed over his greatcoat as he dove into a shell crater. Matthias and Otto tumbled in after him. Above them, the Panther sat burning slowly, engine leaking, track severed, turret locked like a broken jaw. Shermans continued advancing beyond it, not wasting ammunition or time. They simply bypassed the crippled machine and pushed forward toward the collapsing German line. Carl watched them move, steady, relentless, in perfect formation. A cold realization spread through him. This wasn't a battle Germany could win by engineering brilliance alone. This was a battle of systems, logistics, communication, and endurance. And the Americans had mastered all 4. Matthias whispered, "Sir, do you think Berlin knows?" Carl shook his head. "Berlin doesn't understand tanks," he said quietly. "But today, we finally do." Above the tree line, the rising sun glinted off rows of advancing Shermans. It looked less like a tank column and more like the future rolling forward. The 3 men lay in the crater for nearly 10 minutes, breathing steam, hearts pounding, listening to the rhythmic thunder of Shermans rolling past. The American armor didn't linger over kills. It didn't finish off crippled tanks unless they were threats. It didn't waste ammunition. It moved, methodically, purposefully, toward the next objective. And that was the part that chilled Carl the most. This was no longer the fast, chaotic, disorganized American force the Germans remembered from North Africa. This was something new. Something refined. An army that had learned through survival, not sacrifice. Matthias peeked over the edge. They're already half a kilometer ahead. They fight like they're part of a single creature. Karl nodded slowly. One mind. One voice. Every tank talking to the other. Every commander feeding information through the radio network. Every movement coordinated. Otto wiped grime from his eyes. And we fought them with shouting. Karl didn't answer. The truth was bitter enough without words. Snow blew across the crater like drifting ash as they began the long crawl back toward their own lines. They moved from shell hole to shell hole, keeping their heads low as American infantry pressed forward behind their tanks. When they finally reached a trench line held by retreating German grenadiers, the sight was grim. Ammunition crates lay overturned. Medical packs scattered. 2 medics strained to drag a wounded officer through the mud. A Tiger tank in the rear tried desperately to pivot its turret, but the frozen hydraulic system wheezed and groaned, resisting the motion like an arthritic joint. A captain recognized Karl from the armored battalion. "Where is your tank? Why aren't you in it?" Karl pointed behind him. The captain's eyes sank. Another Panther gone? Karl didn't soften it. Track shot off. Turret jammed. Radio useless. The captain cursed under his breath. And the Shermans? Karl exchanged a glance with Matthias and Otto. They had seen something today, something fundamental, something the captain had not. "They're coordinated," Karl said quietly. "Better than we expected. Better than we're prepared for." The captain frowned. "They're Shermans. They burn." "Not the new ones," Karl replied. "Not with wet stowage. And not with crews who know how to escape." His voice dropped. "Sir, their crews survive. Ours don't." The captain froze. That truth was never spoken aloud in the Wehrmacht. Never acknowledged. Never admitted. But here now, in a collapsing front with American tanks cutting through the countryside like blades, denial was a luxury they could no longer afford. They reached the battalion command post, a ruined farmhouse reinforced with sandbags. Major Horst sat at a table covered in maps, his face drawn tight as he listened to crackling radio chatter. Karl saluted weakly. "Our Panther is lost, sir." Horst looked up. "I know. I saw it burning from the ridge." Karl braced himself. "Sir, with respect, the Americans fought today like a single armored fist. Their coordination was flawless. Their tanks..." Horst steepled his fingers. "Their tanks are inferior on paper, yes. But their doctrine is not." Matthias stepped forward, voice trembling with both exhaustion and conviction. "Sir, if German crews had their radios, if our tanks had their escape routes, if we had their survivability..." Horst finished the sentence for him. "We could have fought like them." Silence settled across the command post like heavy dust. Outside, the American advance thundered louder. "Closer. Unstoppable." Otto asked softly, "Sir, what do we do now?" Horst exhaled long and slow. "We fall back. We try to hold the next line. And we hope Berlin understands what is coming." Karl's jaw tightened. "Will they? Sir, will they really understand?" Horst looked at him with a haunted expression. "No," he said. "They will not." A distant explosion lit the dusk as another German tank went up in flames. Shermans continued to push through the gaps, confident, coordinated, and unrelenting. Karl watched the flames dance against the snow and felt the last piece of the truth slide into place. Germany had built the finest tanks in the world. America had built the finest army to use theirs. And in war, it was the second that mattered. Night had fallen, though the forest remained lit with the pale glow of burning villages and scattered artillery flares. The Germans retreated along the frozen tracks, slipping over ice and mud, each step punctuated by the echo of distant Sherman engines. The storm had returned, heavier than before, pelting snow across the battered landscape like shards of glass. Karl, Matthias, and Otto moved with the rest of the surviving troops, keeping low, staying close to walls of felled timber and abandoned hedgerows. The air was thick with smoke, wet wool, and the metallic tang of spilled fuel. Every step was a reminder. Their line was crumbling, their tanks were dying, and the Americans were learning faster than Germany could adapt. In a shallow shell crater, Carl paused, letting the others catch up. He pulled the camera from his coat and unrolled the film, inspecting each frame by the dim red glow of a carbide lamp. The images captured the Sherman interior, the layout, the radios, the seats, the neat ammunition racks. Every photograph told a story of a machine designed around survival, a philosophy of war that valued the crew as much as the weapon itself. He whispered almost to himself, "It's not the armor, it's the crew." Matthias crouched beside him, shivering. "We've seen it firsthand. The difference isn't just in engineering, it's in respect. They respect their men. We worship our tanks." Otto adjusted his greatcoat, eyes scanning the dark tree line. "And that respect, it makes them unstoppable. Look at the way they move today. No panic, no hesitation, no confusion. Every Sherman knew what the others were doing, like parts of one living organism." Carl nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the truth settle in his chest. "And every time one falls, a crew survives to fight again. Every time one of ours falls, a crew is gone. Forever." The sound of engines in the distance reminded them that the night was far from over. Shermans rumbled across the fields, scouting, advancing, pushing the Germans back mile by mile. And yet, Carl knew their small victory, the intelligence they carried, the photographs, the notes, could one day alter the course of armored warfare. He looked at Matthias and Otto, frost forming on their eyelashes, eyes hollow but determined. "We've survived today," Carl said quietly. "We've seen the truth. And we've brought it back. That's something at least." Matthias managed a weak smile. "Something that Berlin will never want to hear." Carl shrugged. "Maybe. But history doesn't care what Berlin wants." They continued along the forest trail, the snow crunching beneath their boots, the wind slicing through their greatcoats. Each step was measured, each breath a battle against the cold. Somewhere behind them, the burning Panthers smoldered in the darkness, a monument to a reality they could no longer ignore. And ahead, through smoke, frost, and the chaos of war, the world was changing. The Americans moved forward, Shermans cutting a path through the night, alive with crew, radios crackling, survival engineered into every inch of their tanks. Carl realized that their tanks, however magnificent, were relics if their men could not endure the fight. He glanced down at the camera again, feeling the weight of the images within. These frames were proof. Proof that the war was no longer just a contest of steel and gunpowder, it was a contest of ideas, of human endurance, and of philosophy made flesh inside a tank. As they reached the relative safety of a lower ridge near the German lines, Carl paused, looking back toward the glowing horizon where the Shermans had gone. The snow fell gently now, muting the world into soft white silence. For a moment, it seemed as though the forest itself was holding its breath, acknowledging the lesson burned into its frozen ground. Carl whispered, "Remember this. Every tank we've lost, every life we couldn't save, it is because we didn't understand what really matters." Matthias nodded, shivering. "And maybe, one day, someone will." Otto exhaled, clouds of vapor curling into the night. "Until then, we survive. That's all we can do." Carl looked at the film again, then at the forest stretching into the darkness. The war would continue. Tanks would fall, lines would shift, and men would die. But the truth of the Sherman, the philosophy of survival, coordination, and crew respect, was a truth they had witnessed, and it could never be unlearned. The wind howled once more through the skeletal trees. The forest whispered with the echo of engines and men. And Carl, Matthias, and Otto pressed forward, carrying the lesson with them, into a war that was changing faster than any of them could have imagined.